Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we slice through complex topics to extract the essential knowledge. Today, we're embarking on a really crucial deep dive into the transatlantic slave trade. Our mission for you is to unpack its origins, the devastating mechanisms, and the far-reaching global impacts. And this is all drawn directly from the source materials you've shared with us, including that edited chapter and the visual context.
That's right. And our goal is really to help you grasp not just the historical facts, but also the profound connections, sometimes uncomfortable connections, between this past and our present. We really want to highlight how such a massive historical event laid foundations that, continue to influence us today.
Okay, let's unpack this then. When we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, we often hear it called the triangular trade. Can you maybe walk us through those three distinct stages?
Absolutely. Think of it like a dark economic circuit connecting three continents. The first leg started in Europe. Ships were loaded up with manufactured goods, things like arms, textiles, wine, and they sailed for Africa. Once there, these goods were exchanged, essentially, for human beings.
And then came the really devastating second leg, the Middle Passage, I imagine.
Precisely. That second leg was the forced transportation of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the Americas. It was horrific, unspeakably brutal. Then, the third leg involved the ships, now loaded with raw materials and cash crops like sugar, coffee, tobacco from the Americas, sailing back to Europe. So it completed the triangle, but, at an unimaginable human cost.
It's fascinating in a grim way how the origins go back to the 15th century. Portuguese ships were kind of the pioneers here, starting to transport Africans for slave labor. But what really supercharged the demand for this labor.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. While it started earlier, the demand truly skyrocketed with the expansion of sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Sugar cultivation was just incredibly labor intensive.
Right.
And as these European colonial ventures grew in the Americas, so did their hunger for a workforce they could exploit without limit. And it wasn't just sugar, of course. Other labor-intensive agricultural enterprises across the Americas also fueled this brutal system.
And the sheer scale of this trade, that's what really hits you from the sources. We're talking about a system that spanned from the mid-16th century all the way until the 1860s. That's, 366 years? Can you try and put the numbers into perspective for us? It's almost hard to comprehend.
The numbers are truly staggering. Over that period, European slavers loaded approximately 12.5 million Africans onto Atlantic slave ships.
12.5 million.
Yeah. And to grasp the full horror, you have to consider this. About 11 million of those actually survived the Middle Passage to make landfall in the Americas. Millions more died along the way, or during the initial capture and transport within Africa itself.
Just devastating. And who are the primary architects of this massive human trafficking operation?
Yeah.
Which nations?
Well, the majority of African captives were carried by the Portuguese and Brazilians. They were followed closely by the British, the French, and the Dutch.
Okay.
It's worth noting that British slave traders alone were responsible for transporting something like 3.5 million Africans to the Americas.
3.5 million, just the British.
Yeah. And when you look at the historical record, the violence and the sheer magnitude of the transatlantic slave trade, it really does appear to exceed any other known instance of large-scale slave trading before Columbus linked the continents.
So, at its core, this was just overwhelmingly driven by economic motivations, right? The sources make that absolutely clear. But what were the specific financial drivers that made this such a ruthlessly efficient system, even if morally reprehensible?
Well, it wasn't just motivated by economics. It was almost like a ruthless economic innovation in itself. This trade essentially created, you could argue, the world's first truly globalized supply chain. And it was perfectly optimized for profit by treating human beings as disposable capital. The insatiable demand wasn't just for labor in the abstract. It was for this new, almost predatory form of wealth creation that hadn't really been seen on this scale before.
Right.
The huge profitability of plantation agriculture churning out those cash crops created an undeniable pull for European economic gain.
And connecting that back to the Americas, it's stark to read how this brutal labor system was considered highly efficient from an economic standpoint, allowing plantation owners to amass just incredible wealth. What does that efficiency truly mean in this context? It sounds so cold.
It does sound cold, and it was. It means that by using enslaved labor, plantation owners drastically minimized their production costs. This allowed them to churn out raw materials, sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee for European markets at unprecedented rates.
Yep.
This efficiency wasn't about technology. It was about the systematic dehumanization and exploitation of millions. It integrated production, shipping, consumption into this tightly controlled, highly profitable system. It really laid the very groundwork for a modern capitalist enterprise, where vast wealth could be generated through the absolute control of labor.
Now, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the effects on Africa itself were truly devastating. What kinds of changes did this trade bring to the continent's political and social organization?
Oh, it fundamentally reshaped societies. The trade stimulated new forms of political and social organization, often very violent ones. It led to a wider and often more brutal use of slaves within Africa itself.
Right.
And it fostered these incredibly callous attitudes towards human suffering because the pursuit of captives became central to many power dynamics.
And the economic fallout, that must have been catastrophic. I read how it reduced once strong economies to essentially a monoculture based on the sale of human beings.
Right.
Can you elaborate a bit on that economic disarray?
Yet imagine entire communities constantly living in fear of slave raids. This fear, combined with the strong economic incentives for warlords and tribes to engage in the trade, well, it promoted a massive depopulation. And it made any meaningful agricultural or economic development almost impossible in vast areas. So instead of diverse economies growing and innovating, you had entire regions becoming focused on just one commodity. Human beings. It was a fundamentally extractive system that just drained Africa of its most vital resource, its people, and crippled its potential for centuries.
And the demographic impact you mentioned, it's just heartbreaking. The sources mentioned that in 1750, the African population was about 13% of the global total, right?
Yes.
And it only got back to that same 13% in 2014. That's 250 years later. 112 million more Africans if there had been no slave trade.
That single statistic just hangs in the air, doesn't it? It absolutely does. It's not just a number. It's the ghost of generations of innovation, of culture that was simply stolen. And beyond the sheer numbers, slave raiding ultimately weakened the social fabric of African societies. It denied the continent much-needed human capital, the very people who would have built, invented, and led.
Yeah.
Now, there's ongoing historical debate about whether the trade was the sole cause or fundamental versus marginal to Africa's later problems. But the evidence is compelling. It cast a long, enduring shadow over a really wide range of societal outcomes.
What kind of long-term outcomes are we talking about there?
We're talking about fundamental shifts in things like economic prosperity, ethnic diversity, the quality of institutions, even the prevalence of conflict. Researchers have also drawn links to long-term impacts on things like trust levels within communities, female labor force participation rates, and even the practice of polygyny in some areas. The ripples were just profound and incredibly far-reaching.
So you have these devastating impacts on Africa, the brutal creation of wealth in the Americas, and those ripple effects inevitably flowed back across the Atlantic to Europe. Let's trace how Europe itself was profoundly shaped by the system it largely created. The sources say the Atlantic slave trade significantly contributed to the activity of many provision and redistribution markets. How did that translate into financial benefits?
Well, it was a massive engine of wealth creation for certain parts of Europe. The trade allowed for the creation of these immense fortunes.
Right.
And that money was then funneled back into various other economic activities within Europe. This capital, amassed directly from the slave trade and the products of slave labor, contributed directly to the industrialization of Europe, particularly in Britain, which, as we know, led the Industrial Revolution.
There's a direct link there.
A very strong link. So you have this real paradox, the exploitation of millions of human beings directly fueling what was presented at the time as progress and innovation.
But there was a subtle negative consequence mentioned for Europe, too, wasn't there? Something about manufactured goods.
Yes, that's an interesting point from the sources. While it generated vast wealth for some, those very colonial products, sugar, tobacco, etc., because they were relatively costly for the average person, they actually curbed the acquisition of domestically manufactured products for the broader population within Europe. So it's a complex legacy. Even the quote-unquote beneficiary continent experienced some unexpected economic distortions.
Okay, this is where the story takes such a critical turn when we look at the Americas themselves. This trade just fundamentally altered the economic, political, social, and cultural makeup of the entire hemisphere. How crucial was enslaved African labor to that transformation?
It wasn't just crucial. It was absolutely foundational. You can't overstate it. Enslaved African labor wasn't just a component. It was the foundation of the plantation economies.
Right.
Those economies were laser focused on cultivating raw materials and cash crops again. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee, specifically for those hungry European markets. Without this forced labor, the scale of production and the sheer accumulation of wealth in the New World, it just wouldn't have been possible. Not even close.
So the sources state that the slave trade and slave labor were truly central to the early stages of capitalism in the New World. What does that mean for how we understand today's globalized economy? It sounds like a pretty direct lineage.
It does. It means the very roots of our modern capitalist economy are deeply intertwined with this system of exploitation. The transatlantic slave trade was a key component in linking the economies of Africa, the Americas, and Europe. It established these complex economic networks, networks for the exchange of goods, capital, and, crucially, labor across continents. This was, in many ways, the genesis of today's deeply interconnected globalized financial system. It forced the world into a new kind of economic relationship, one driven relentlessly by profit, often at any human cost.
And for the enslaved population and their descendants, the socioeconomic consequences were, of course, devastating and lasting. This exploitation didn't just strip them of their labor and rights in the moment, it entrenched inequalities that, as the sources highlight, persist to this day. How did those inequalities become so deeply rooted?
Well, the system was designed to create and maintain them. That was its purpose economically. By legally defining people as property, by systematically denying them education, land ownership, basic human rights. It created a permanent underclass whose forced labor generated wealth for others.
Right.
This was then combined with and justified by assumptions, attitudes, and prejudices about race. These paved the way for the racist belief systems that came later, belief systems specifically designed to justify the ongoing exploitation and oppression long after slavery itself was abolished. The echoes of that foundational design, we still feel them very strongly today.
And yet, despite this immense suffering and dehumanization, one of the most powerful aspects that comes through in the sources is the incredible resilience and the profound cultural contributions of enslaved Africans. How did they manage to forge new identities and cultures under such brutal conditions? It seems almost impossible.
It truly is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Enslaved Africans brought with them rich cultural traditions from diverse parts of Africa, music, dance, storytelling, spiritual beliefs. And against all odds, they found ways not just to preserve, but to adapt them. They blended these African traditions with elements of European and indigenous cultures they encountered in the Americas, creating entirely new, distinct African-American cultures. This wasn't just about survival. It was an act of profound creation and resistance in the face of efforts to strip them of their humanity.
And the influence of these emerging African-American cultures on American history and society, it's just been immense, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely profound. Think about the significant contributions to American culture across so many fronts. Visual arts, crafts, language, and especially music. I mean, jazz, blues, gospel. These foundational American art forms sprang directly from this experience. Even cuisine has deep roots there. Enslaved Africans demonstrated remarkable resilience, developing new cultural forms, incredibly strong kinship ties, even when families were forcibly broken apart. They preserved their heritage through oral histories, through music, through communal practices.
Which raises, I think, an important and difficult question. What are the persistent long-term consequences for African-American communities today stemming from this history?
The enduring impact is, well, it's undeniably evident in things like systemic racism, ongoing social inequality, and economic disparities. The structures and attitudes that were forged during slavery didn't just disappear with abolition. They continued, evolving through Jim Crow and beyond, shaping the opportunities and challenges faced by African-American communities right up to this very day.
And it seems this historical trauma of slavery continues to shape not just American society, but global perceptions and power dynamics as well, contributing to ongoing struggles for racial justice and equity all around the world. Well, we've truly taken a deep dive into the transatlantic slave trade today. We've tried to understand its origins, its brutal mechanisms, and its far-reaching consequences. Consequences that reverberated across continents and, as we've discussed, continue to shape our world.
Absolutely. And understanding this profound and complex history is just essential. It's not just about acknowledging historical injustices, which is critical in itself. It's also about recognizing how these events actively continue to shape our present and influence the ongoing work towards a more equitable and inclusive future. It really is about seeing the threads that connect us, all of us, to this past.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We want to leave you with a provocative thought to consider. How do the complex economic networks established by the transatlantic slave trade, which we've talked about as foundational to early capitalism, how do they continue to subtly influence modern global trade systems and even cultural exchanges today? Even beyond the obvious horrific human rights implications, how do echoes of its foundational structure still resonate in our interconnected world? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.